We'll walk through the essentials of adopting the cloud at scale. In session 2, we'll set up your cloud financial success and learn about pricing resources. In session 3, we'll establish cloud readiness and set your foundation. And then in session 4, still in part 1, we'll walk through how to design and govern well-architected workloads. Then in part 2, we'll start with session 5, where we'll cover how to manage and optimize your environments. In session 6, we will discuss how to use the tools to optimize your cloud spend. And then finally, in session 7, we'll wrap up the course by covering a case study, review and remediate a workload deployed in production. So let's get into session 1. So let's get started with a session architecture and compute. As you can see for the agenda for today, the first one that we're going to talk about is essentials of adopting the cloud at scale. We'll also get into leveraging financial best practices and learning about pricing resources. And then expect a break, and then we'll come back from break and do establish cloud readiness and set your foundation. We'll have another break, and then we'll talk about design and govern well-architected workloads, and then a final closing Q&A. So let's get into day 1. So day 1, the first thing we're going to discuss is we're going to talk about essentials of adopting the cloud at scale. So for the learning objectives, the first thing we're going to talk about is applying those Azure essentials. We'll get into the FinOps, so understanding how FinOps works. We'll also talk about best practices and how you establish those. We'll then also get into platform landing zones, which is a key topic that you really need to grasp so that you can really deploy your Azure workloads and all that. And then finally, we'll understand how to navigate that Azure pricing. So let's begin. So let's start with our first learning objective, and that's applying Azure Essentials to adopt the cloud at scale. So when we think about that, we think about building reliable and secure systems as a shared responsibility. Microsoft has a shared responsibility model that you might have heard about before, and this is not new to Microsoft or anything. That you've got what we call infrastructure as a service, you've got your platform as a service, and you've got your software as a service. So depending on what workloads you're building and how you want to deploy those workloads, it's all up to you, the customer, on how much you want to put in for yourself. So for example, when we think about the resilient and secure foundation, that's what Microsoft does. So Microsoft is the one that builds your data centers in the different regions close to where you may be, and you can take advantage of those data centers. Those data centers have all your server workloads, and you just use our hardware. The next is then we look at our cloud adoption framework. And the cloud adoption framework, again, up to you, but it is there for you so that you can take advantage of, some of the best practices or use some of the best practices that we have. So you can enable them as you need in your environment. So for example, disaster recovery. It's a big key topic, in the cloud, because as you're deploying to multiple regions, you'll want to implement a disaster recovery, but it's not implemented by default. It's up to you, the customer, to implement these services and these features. And then finally, your application will sit right on top of however you deployed that environment. And when you deploy that environment, you can then make sure that your application is being backed up, and that's your responsibility. So leveraging the reliability and security of the cloud and enabling that reliability and security in the cloud. So balance comes in several forms. We talk about achieving balance, and that's talking about control and stability, and then speed and results. To meet these goals and achieving these balances, Microsoft has some frameworks that you can use. The one that we have is called the Cloud Adoption Framework. The Cloud Adoption Framework is all about people and processes. So think about, when you're about ready to deploy Azure and who you're going to get involved, right? Who are your stakeholders? And then, the buy-ins. Those are the types of people and processes that you need. What is the governance, right? What's that security? And that's all part of the Cloud Adoption Framework. The next one is our well-architected framework. And with the well-architected framework, this is great once you've got that buy-in and you know what you're going to be deploying, right? So what type of services, what type of requirements you you need and you've met your stakeholders' needs, then you can start looking at the best practices. And that's part of our well-architected framework. Actually, both of these have best practices, and it depends on what part of your journey you're at. So with the cloud adoption framework, you're looking at finding the people, finding those processes, right? And then with the well-architected framework, you've met those people and processes. And now you're ready to start deploying your services. So each one of them have their own documentation with that, and they also come with their own best practices, as well as some templates and tools. We'll talk about a lot of the tools in the next couple days. So in this slide, what you can see is what we just talked about in the other slide was the well-architected framework. So this is some experiences with our customers when they're using that well-architected framework, how much they've saved, right? So 50% avoided revenue loss due to resilience issues. We got 650K 3-year present value and improved resilience, and then 30% reduction in planned downtime. We also have some voices of the customer where they talked about how using our frameworks have helped support their journey into Azure. So Azure Essentials, they provide that prescriptive guidance base. So Azure optimization is the process of driving continuous improvement of your architecture and workloads while managing and optimizing your cloud cost. When we look at the guidance for an organization that is adopting that cloud, they look at defining the strategy. So that's your beginning. So creating your business case, getting those stakeholders buy-in and everything. Then you start looking at that plan, and that's where we look at the cloud adoption framework. These two will work really well with your cloud adoption framework using those. And then that way you can align to our strategy. Once you're ready, then think about Azure landing zones. There's actually a section we're going to talk about later today when we get into landing zones. So to me, I think of it as like a big blueprint, right? I want to deploy more than one subscription, or I want to deploy multiple environments like production, development, beta, and I don't want to have to keep doing there. I have some governance and some things that I need to do. So I want to make sure that they're across all of them. So think of it as like a template deployment at a large scale. And then we talk about adopting, right? So designing and building and deploying those workloads. And what kind of workloads can you design and deploy? Finally, then we also get into, govern, manage, govern, and security. 3 big key concepts. So once you've got everything deployed, then how do you manage that? Once you want to make sure that you're meeting the guidelines of your company, that's where we look at governing it. And then finally, that's security. One of the things I can tell you, the Microsoft Cloud has so much security features and services that you can utilize in your organization. So here's the key components when we look at a specific workload. You've got your 5 stages. You got reliability, security, cost optimization, operational excellence, and performance efficiency. You'll hear those 5 topics a lot when we talk about working with our frameworks. So Azure Essentials, it offers you many products that you can use that are based on these best practices. Like one of my favorite is the Azure policy. One of those policies where, you want to, let's say, for example, you want to make sure when anybody deploys a workload that they put a backup in, because that isn't set up by default. And it's funny how some people think, just because I deploy a workload in the cloud, it must be being backed up. Well, no, that's your responsibility. So with Azure Policy, you can implement these policies to ensure people are doing things that they didn't think that they needed to, right? Azure Monitor, great for, Azure Monitor is based up with alerts, it's got logging, and it's got metrics. So those 3 key components that you can find out, I can find out exactly my real-time metrics on my machine. I can then look at more logging. So if there's something that went wrong, you can go back to the logs and review that. The logs can be outputted to different systems as well, and I can be alerted, right? So let's say you have a compute workload that's hitting 90%. You can get an email or a text that says my workload's hitting that. So we'll look at some of these products. I'll even demo some of these products, and you'll do some in a lab yourself. So with the learning topics on Microsoft Learn, you have broken down into 4 key topics, as you can see. So one of them is going to be FinOps, which we'll talk about shortly. We'll talk about skilling to adopt Azure at scale, on skilling to design well-architected workloads, as well as skilling to ensure reliability, security, and continuous improvement. So using these Microsoft Learn, you'll get to see, or read, I should say, all about these topics. So the 3 stages of adopting Azure at scale. So we're currently living in a time of significant technological innovation. That means there is a huge opportunity in front of us to modernize cloud and environments and accelerate growth. So with that, we think about our set up a strong foundation, and the 3 stages, when we look at that, we look at manage and optimize, we look at readiness and foundation, and finally we look at design, deploy. And as you can see, it's a cycle. Right? So you're constantly going in a cycle and you're constantly hitting these 3 stages. So let's get into readiness and foundation. So this is going to set up your cloud adoption. So working with your cloud adoption framework. It's going to give you your best best practices. It's going to set up those centralized cloud operations. And then my favorite is it's going to get into deploying those landing zones. The landing zones is going to make things so much easier for you and making sure that you're meeting all of your best practices and your cost optimization. Now that we just set up your cloud financial success and learn about pricing resources. So in this learning objectives, we're going to talk about understanding what FinOps is and why it's important, learn about pricing resources and how to optimize those investments, discover Microsoft solutions and tools. And then, talk about these tools, right? So what are they? So we got cost management, we got Azure Advisor, we got Azure Policy, and many more that we can get into. So with the cloud growth forecast, organizations continue to adopt the cloud. Gartner predicts that by 2026, 75% of organizations will adopt the digital transformation model predicted on the cloud as the fundamental underlying platform. While cloud infrastructure and platform services are driving the highest spending growth, SaaS, software as a service, remains the largest segment of the cloud, marketing by end user spending. An example of SaaS would be something like Microsoft 365. Gartner predicts that by 2026, more than 80% of enterprises will have generative artificial intelligence. AI is fastly growing, as you've heard in the market. And with this, we're looking at, Gen AI-enabled applications in production environments up from less than 5% in 2023. Challenges in the financial journey. So we're looking at, accurately forecasting AI implementation costs, aligning AI investments with long-term financial sustainability. Challenges that we need to look at when we this is of the customer, where they talked about how using our frameworks have helped support workloads you're building, it's your cloud spend. And then finally, in session 7, we'll
Hello and welcome to this virtual session. We're glad you can join us today. Before we get started, there's a few housekeeping items we'd like to go over with you now. Firstly, you can resize the webinar windows to cater to your viewing preferences. You can maximize, minimize, and drag the windows to your preferred viewing size. If you look at the bottom middle of your screen, you can click on the widgets that you'll need to get the most out of this virtual experience. Secondly, Microsoft specialists are on hand to answer your questions in real time. So feel free to type in your questions using the Q&A window and we'll answer them as soon as we can. Lastly, we've provided some additional resources for you to supplement your learning. You can access them by clicking on the links in this section. Without further ado, I'll hand over to our speakers.
Hello and welcome to the Microsoft Azure Virtual Training Day course, Mastering Reliability, Security, and Performance on Azure. My name is Sarah Kong and I'm a Microsoft Certified Trainer. This course consists of 7 sessions that's covered in 2 parts. Part 1 will begin with Session 1, where we'll walk through the essentials of adopting the cloud at scale. In Session 2, we'll set up your cloud financial success and learn about pricing resources. In Session 3, we'll establish cloud readiness and set your foundation. And then in Session 4, still in Part 1, we'll walk through how to design and govern well-architected workloads. Then in Part 2, we'll start with Session 5, where we'll cover how to manage and optimize your environments. In Session 6, we will discuss how to use the tools to optimize your cloud spend. And then finally, in Session 7, we'll wrap up the course by covering a case study, review and remediate a workload deployed in production. So let's get into Session 1. So let's get started with a session architecture and compute. As you can see for the agenda for today, the first one that we're going to talk about is essentials of adopting the cloud at scale. We'll also get into leveraging financial best practices and learning about pricing resources. And then expect a break, and then we'll come back from break and do establish cloud readiness and set your foundation. We'll have another break, and then we'll talk about design and govern well-architected workloads, and then a final closing Q&A. So let's get into day 1. So day 1, the first thing we're going to discuss is we're going to talk about essentials of adopting the cloud at scale. So for the learning objectives, the first thing we're going to talk about is applying those Azure essentials. We'll get into the FinOps, so understanding how FinOps works. We'll also talk about best practices and how you establish those. We'll then also get into platform landing zones, which is a key topic that you really need to grasp so that you can really deploy your Azure workloads and all that. And then finally, we'll understand how to navigate that Azure pricing. So let's begin. So let's start with our first learning objective, and that's applying Azure essentials to adopt the cloud at scale. So when we think about that, we think about building reliable and secure systems as a shared responsibility. Microsoft has a shared responsibility model that you might have heard about before, and this is not new to Microsoft or anything. That you've got what we call infrastructure as a service, you've got your platform as a service, and you've got your software as a service. So depending on what workloads you're building and how you want to deploy those workloads, it's all up to you, the customer, on how much you want to put in for yourself. So for example, when we think about the resilient and secure foundation, that's what Microsoft does. So Microsoft is the one that builds your data centers in the different regions close to where you may be, and you can take advantage of those data centers. Those data centers have all your server workloads, and you just use our hardware. The next is then we look at our cloud adoption framework. And the cloud adoption framework, again, up to you, but it is there for you so that you can take advantage of, some of the best practices or use some of the best practices that we have. So you can enable them as you need in your environment. So for example, disaster recovery. It's a big key topic, in the cloud, because as you're deploying to multiple regions, you'll want to implement a disaster recovery, but it's not implemented by default. It's up to you, the customer, to implement these services and these features. And then finally, your application will sit right on top of however you deployed that environment. And when you deploy that environment, you can then make sure that your application is being backed up, and that's your responsibility. So leveraging the reliability and security of the cloud and enabling that reliability and security in the cloud. So balance comes in several forms. We talk about achieving balance, and that's talking about control and stability, and then speed and results. To meet these goals and achieving these balances, Microsoft has some frameworks that you can use. The one that we have is called the Cloud Adoption Framework. The Cloud Adoption Framework is all about people and processes. So think about, when you're about ready to deploy Azure and who you're going to get involved, right? Who are your stakeholders? And then, the buy-ins. Those are the types of people and processes that you need. What is the governance, right? What's that security? And that's all part of the Cloud Adoption Framework. The next one is our well-architected framework. And with the well-architected framework, this is great once you've got that buy-in and you know what you're going to be deploying, right? So what type of services, what type of requirements you need and you've met your stakeholders' needs, then you can start looking at the best practices. And that's part of our well-architected framework. Actually, both of these have best practices, and it depends on what part of your journey you're at. So with the Cloud Adoption Framework, you're looking at finding the people, finding those processes, right? And then with the well-architected framework, you've met those people and processes. And now you're ready to start deploying your services. So each one of them have their own documentation with that, and they also come with their own best practices, as well as some templates and tools. We'll talk about a lot of the tools in the next couple days. So in this slide, what you can see is what we just talked about in the other slide was the well-architected framework. So this is some experiences with our customers when they're using that well-architected framework, how much they've saved, right? So 50% avoided revenue loss due to resilience issues. We got 650K 3-year present value and improved resilience, and then 30% reduction in planned downtime. We also have some voices of the customer where they talked about how using our frameworks have helped support their journey into Azure. So Azure Essentials, they provide that prescriptive guidance base. So Azure optimization is the process of driving continuous improvement of your architecture and workloads while managing and optimizing your cloud cost. When we look at the guidance for an organization that is adopting that cloud, they look at defining the strategy. So that's your beginning. So creating your business case, getting those stakeholders buy-in and everything. Then you start looking at that plan, and that's where we look at the Cloud Adoption Framework. These two will work really well with your Cloud Adoption Framework using those. And then that way you can align to our strategy. Once you're ready, then think about Azure landing zones. There's actually a section we're going to talk about later today when we get into landing zones. So to me, I think of it as like a big blueprint, right? I want to deploy more than one subscription, or I want to deploy multiple environments like production, development, beta, and I don't want to have to keep doing there. I have some governance and some things that I need to do. So I want to make sure that they're across all of them. So think of it as like a template deployment at a large scale. And then we talk about adopting, right? So designing and building and deploying those workloads. And what kind of workloads can you design and deploy? Finally, then we also get into, govern, manage, govern, and security. 3 big key concepts. So once you've got everything deployed, then how do you manage that? Once you want to make sure that you're meeting the guidelines of your company, that's where we look at governing it. And then finally, that's security. One of the things I can tell you, the Microsoft Cloud has so much security features and services that you can utilize in your organization. So here's the key components when we look at a specific workload. You've got your 5 stages. You got reliability, security, cost optimization, operational excellence, and performance efficiency. You'll hear those 5 topics a lot when we talk about working with our frameworks. So Azure Essentials, it offers you many products that you can use that are based on these best practices. Like one of my favorite is the Azure policy. One of those policies where, you want to, let's say, for example, you want to make sure when anybody deploys a workload that they put a backup in, because that isn't set up by default. And it's funny how some people think, just because I deploy a workload in the cloud, it must be being backed up. Well, no, That's your responsibility. So with Azure Policy, you can implement these policies to ensure people are doing things that they didn't think that they needed to, right? Azure Monitor, great for, Azure Monitor is based up with alerts, it's got logging, and it's got metrics. So those three key components that you can find out, I can find out exactly my real-time metrics on my machine. I can then look at more logging. So if there's something that went wrong, you can go back to the logs and review that. The logs can be outputted to different systems as well, and I can be alerted, right? So let's say you have a compute workload that's hitting 90%. You can get an email or a text that says my workload's hitting that. So we'll look at some of these products. I'll even demo some of these products, and you'll do some in a lab yourself. So with the learning topics on Microsoft Learn, you have broken down into 4 key topics, as you can see. So one of them is going to be FinOps, which we'll talk about shortly. We'll talk about skilling to adopt Azure at scale, on skilling to design well-architected workloads, as well as skilling to ensure reliability, security, and continuous improvement. So using these Microsoft Learn, you'll get to see, or read, I should say, all about these topics. So the 3 stages of adopting Azure at scale. So we're currently living in a time of significant technological innovation. That means there is a huge opportunity in front of us to modernize cloud and environments and accelerate growth. So with that, we think about our set up a strong foundation, and the 3 stages, when we look at that, we look at manage and optimize, we look at readiness and foundation, and finally we look at design, deploy. And as you can see, it's a cycle. Right? So you're constantly going in a cycle, and you're constantly hitting these 3 stages. So let's get into readiness and foundation. So this is going to set up your cloud adoption. So working with your cloud adoption framework. It's going to give you your best best practices. It's going to set up those centralized cloud operations. And then my favorite is it's going to get into deploying those landing zones. The landing zones is going to make things so much easier for you and making sure that you're meeting all of your best practices and your cost optimization. Now that we discussed essentials of adopting the cloud at scale, let's move on to session 2, where we'll set up your cloud financial success and learn about pricing resources. So in this learning objectives, we're going to talk about understanding what FinOps is and why it's important, learn about pricing resources and how to optimize those investments, discover Microsoft solutions and tools, and then talk about these tools, right? So what are they? So we got cost management, we got Azure Advisor, we got Azure Policy, and many more that we can get into. So with the cloud growth forecast, organizations continue to adopt the cloud. Gartner predicts that by 2026, 75% of organizations will adopt the digital transformation model predicted on the cloud as the fundamental underlying platform. While cloud infrastructure and platform services are driving the highest spending growth, SaaS, software as a service, remains the largest segment of the cloud, marketing by end user spending. An example of SaaS would be something like Microsoft 365. Gartner predicts that by 2026, more than 80% of enterprises will have generative artificial intelligence. AI is fastly growing, as you've heard, in the market. And with this, we're looking at, Gen AI-enabled applications in production environments up from less than 5% in 2023. Challenges in the financial journey. So we're looking at, accurately forecasting AI implementation costs, aligning AI investments with long-term financial sustainability. So there's many challenges that we need to look at when we start adopting artificial intelligence. The security of artificial intelligence and the best practices that we'll need to follow. So the roadmap to success is effective financial management, right? Extending beyond just having access to tools. This guide aligns with the financial best practices from the FinOps frameworks by the FinOps Foundation, which supports your long-term objectives by fostering organizational and cultural shifts toward financial responsibility and efficiency. This alignment ensures that your AI initiatives deliver a positive return on investment and are aligned into your broader financial strategy. Leverage this guide to equip your team with the knowledge, best practices, and tools necessary to strike a balance between innovation and cost efficiency. Whether you're at the initial stages of AI exploration or looking to refine your existing AI strategies, this comprehensive guide will provide valuable insights and practical steps and resources to help you navigate the financial complexity of AI adoption. To help you understand and address these challenges, the FinOps framework offers best practices to help you manage and optimize the cloud to maximize business value. In this session, we'll walk you through the framework and the Microsoft solutions that can help you adopt best practices to support your cloud journey. So what is it, FinOps? As defined in the FinOps Foundation Technical Advisory Council, FinOps is an operational framework. We've heard about the two other frameworks, cloud adoption and the well-architected framework. So now let's talk about the FinOps framework. And it's a best practice which maximizes the business value of cloud and enables timely data-driven decision-making and creates financial accountability through collaboration between engineering, finance, and business teams. Primary components of the FinOps framework, as we can see in here, there's the principles, phases, domains, and capabilities. When we look at these and break them down to 3 sections, the principle is where you need to collaborate, right? You're working with your team. Everyone needs to take ownership. This is where you're working with your stakeholders. The reports should be accessible and timely, right? These are, as you can see in here, your core persons. So you've got your FinOps practitioner, you've got engineering, finance, leadership, product, procurement. Think about using the principles with this is also kind of aligning with your cloud adoption framework, right? Those peoples and processes. And the next thing we've got our phases. So you need to inform, optimize, and operate, right? That whole crawl, walk, run maturity. Domains and capabilities. So understanding the cloud usage and costs, optimizing cloud usage and costs, managing those FinOps practices and quantifying those business values. When we think about all of this, it's really about starting from the beginning, so that crawl, walk, and run. And it can be quite overwhelming. So if you're working with our frameworks and putting them in when you need to, then it can get easier, right? As you grow. So task in each FinOps phase is the inform phase, right? So this is where you're going to provide the teams, right? Letting them know, this is, based on the tags that I use. Now, I'm an old SharePoint administrator, and I don't mean old and old. I've just been doing it for a long time. And as a SharePoint administrator, one of the things that I always implemented was metadata. Metadata is essential to any type of web deployment, especially in the cloud. Right? It's so that I can track things, I can tag things. So imagine you had, an application you deployed, right? And that application used a database. It uses, compute workloads. It uses, monitoring and everything. So when you're using the same tags on that application, then I can filter on those tags and I can go into my cost optimization and know how much this application is costing me. When we think about the optimize phase, this is working with our KPIs. So now I've implemented those tags, and now with those tags, I can then work with Power BI, and I can build these KPIs and give those beautiful little dashboards that, leadership loves, right? So that way I can see everything on the screen, and I know how much I'm spending, how this growth is happening, and so on and so forth. And then with that, I'll be able to evaluate that and continually move on. So beginning, tagging, making sure that you're, putting in those, allocating things properly. And then secondly, I'm optimizing that by building KPIs and monitoring that. And then third, based on those optimization and monitoring, I can now look at how my operation phase is working, right? Am I hitting those best practices? So the centralized team drives that best practice. When we think of that, the FinOps team sits in the middle, coordinating it and facilities the activities of each of the personas. It drives the FinOps culture through best practices, education, standardization, and support. In this model, a cross-functional team known as CCOE, Cloud Cost Center of Excellence, interacts with the rest of the business to manage the cloud strategy, governance, and best practices that the rest of the organization can leverage to transform the business using the cloud. Hierarchy is flexible. Now, you notice in that slide, I just said best practices how many times? Many times. And the reason why we always suggest best practices is we gather our best practices from our customers. So people that are doing it already and what they find works well. And so then we implement those into our best practices. Now, in most organizations, you will see the 3 C's, CTO, CIO, CFO, but that can be flexible, right? Your hierarchy might be different. But essentially, you're going to have these different personas that work in your cloud strategy. So the primary objective of FinOps goes beyond cost reduction. To empower your team in adopting FinOps best practices, Microsoft offers a suite of solutions capable of supporting all 18, I know I said 18, FinOps capabilities by leveraging tools or resources like cost management, Fabric, Azure Advisor, Microsoft FinOps Review, Microsoft FinOps Docs, and more. Your team can effectively implement FinOps best practice and realize your business goals. In this slide, you'll find a quick overview of the capabilities of each solution, which can enhance and support beyond cost reduction and maximize that value. So let's explore a use case of FinOps. In this case, you can see it becomes evident that FinOps extends its benefits beyond mere cost savings and cloud usage. The organization in question significantly enhanced its operational efficiency by embracing FinOps best practices. They proactively committed to cost-saving measures through commitment-based discounts and diligently optimized their internal processes, which resulted in heightened financial accountability. The outcome of these efforts were the ability to reallocate previously tied up funds. With these freed resources, the organization made strategic investments in critical areas such as security enhancements. Additionally, they directed their newfound financial flexibility towards adopting cutting-edge technologies like AI, artificial intelligence. This empowered them to create innovative end products and enhance their services. This scenario perfectly illustrates how organizations can leverage FinOps not only to curtail costs, but more importantly, to unlock resources for driving market differentiation. It showcased the transformative potential of adopting FinOps best practices, ultimately leading to greater competitiveness and innovation. So now, reducing carbon emissions through FinOps. This is very important in this day and age. In this second scenario, we encounter organization grappling with the challenges posed by carbon emission regulations. This organization is compelled to enhance its capability to track and optimize emissions and effectively ensure compliance with the stringent regulatory standards. In this case, the organization can harness the power of FinOps best practices. By implementing FinOps methodologies, they can align their financial and operational processes with sustainability goals. This alignment not only aids in minimizing carbon emissions, but also assists in avoiding potential penalties and repercussions associated with regulatory non-compliance. FinOps in this context emerges as a valuable ally in steering the organization towards its sustainability objectives. Now, Microsoft solutions can support all FinOps capabilities. As you can see in here, there's many different types of tools that you can use to support kind of what I just talked about, right? So in those two use cases, we talked about how a company can grow and modernize their environment. And that's basically, an example of that is like you can deploy your workloads using, doing a lift and shift migration. And then once you do that lift and shift migration, then you can look at modernizing, and that's where FinOps can help you. And then in that second use case, we talked about carbon emissions. Right? You're a company that has to meet these carbon emission guidelines, and that's how FinOps can help you. So in this slide, we talk about, some of the tools that you can use to meet and successfully produce those two use case. So when we think about, Microsoft cost management, for example, think about, I want to now deploy my workloads and modernize them. But is that really going to be efficient for me and cost saving? So we'll use the Microsoft cost management. And then you think about the carbon, right? And I need to meet those carbon regulatory requirements. What can I use to make sure that all my deployments are meeting that? Well, that could be Azure policy. Right? So these are some examples of how you can use some of these tools to meet those two use cases. And we'll get into those tools a little bit more. Next up, I'm going to show you a demo, and this demo is going to go through the FinOps interactive guide. All right, so for this demo, we're going to talk about the overview of FinOps, and this is an interactive guide. Interactive guides are quite interesting here. Let me go to it. Is because you can run through these, and it gives you kind of that real-world example experience, or that hands-on experience, not necessarily real world, but that hands-on experience, but it's interactive, and it guides you through each step. So as you can see in here, there is actually 6 exercises. We've got allocation, we've got reporting and analytics, we got workload optimization, anomaly management, forecasting, budgeting, rate optimization, and cloud sustainability. So let's take a look at some of these. I'm not going to walk through all of them because, as you can see, it takes approximately an hour to do, but you will get a link yourself to be able to do this. But we'll take a look at a couple of them so you can see what to expect. So I'm going to go ahead and go into allocation. And so as you can see, it kind of runs like a video environment. And so when you click on play, this takes you into the actual interactive guide. And pay attention over here on this side, because in here, this is going to give you information, and I don't have my volume on, but you would also be able to hear a track over top. So someone speaking and reading this information to you. And so as you can see in here, let me go back a little bit first. Let it run. So you can see it takes about 18 minutes. And then in here, let me pause right there. So you can see you can play and pause. Is you're going to go through in this interactive guide. You're going to analyze and track cloud spending. You're going to identify cost-saving opportunities. And you're going to allocate cost to teams, projects, or products. And as you go through each step, it walks you through what you're going to do. So in here, as you can see, I go in, navigate, and you just click on here, and then that'll take you to each section. And again, as I was saying earlier, focus on here, and if you've got the sound on, right, you can listen to as they're reading that. And essentially what they're doing is they're just reading this section over here. And so in here, it talks about, goes through the management groups and setting up groups, putting your subscriptions in the groups, and then going into cost management. And with the cost management, this is where you can go in and start working with your routes or your management groups and applying cost landing zones and so on to each of that. So that's the first one. So let's go back, close this up. So let's take a look at reporting and analytics, and we'll click open on this. You can see it takes approximately 7 minutes. We'll start this. And then goes through, tells you again, 7 minutes. And you're going to perform some reporting and analytics using FinOps. Right, so now in here, you just essentially follow the prompts on the screen. This one, you're going to go into the cost analysis, and you're also going to go and look at accumulated costs. And then it talks about how you can see the different types of groups. You can scroll through the different groups. This is, if you remember, me saying earlier that tagging is so essential when it comes to doing any type of analysis, but especially cost, right? Like, I highly recommend that you always tag your information. But even if you don't, you can see, you can even just filter and get a cost based on your resource group. So this is why, again, resource groups are very essential as well, because when you create resource groups, I can put all the resources. So let's say I have a resource group called databases. Then I can put all my databases in a single resource group, and I can go in and I can do a cost analysis on how much money I'm spending on databases, for example. All right, so think about the way that your company needs to get information of your analysis. Like, what's your concern about spending? And then that will help you determine, how you're going to tag and organize that information. The other thing is that resource groups are very much, to me, very much a security level, right? So I'm going to create resource groups because I want to make sure that anybody that get access to the resources in this resource group is because they need that access. Right? And you'll see that a lot of times. You get the Azure administrators or AZ-104 or Azure architects, so the AZ-305 class, they'll talk about, going into cost analysis and, the difference between resource groups and tags and all of that. So now in here I can go in, filter by a tag and that cost center, and I can see, what am I spending? And then the nice thing is I can download information, and you've got your three options, right? It can be a PNG file, which you'll take the pictures of these, it could be an Excel doc, or it could be even a CSV. And then you can download that data and be able to view that data in a better one. And then think what you can do with Excel docs, right? You can go in with the Excel docs, and then you can go into Power BI and start really working with all of this. So that goes through a little bit more about the reporting. The other one is we've got workload optimization. So in this section, or in this interactive guide, this is where you're going to go through and you're going to improve your workload optimization. Right? And essentially what you're going to do is you're going to follow the prompts in here, and you're going to look at Azure Advisor, right? And look at, what are the big issues, or what are the impacts? So Azure Advisor is, like I said, your cloud consultant. It's one of those ones that you definitely want to always be looking at, so that way you can see what the recommended actions are. And that's kind of what that exercise goes through. You've got anomaly management. There we go. And there you've got two. This one's a shorter one, takes only a couple minutes. This one's going to go through and show you how to manage any anomalies that you might have in your environment. And to do that, that's going to go in and again, go to your cost alerts. You go in and add an alert rule, right? And there you go. There's the alert type. As you can see in here, it's an anomaly. I have a problem saying that word. There we go. And then from there, you can go in and view through that. So I'll let you work through that one later. The other one is forecasting. So forecasting, this one's a longer one, as you can see, 16 minutes. And so what this one does is it's going to show you how to perform forecasting again with FinOps. And so with this one, you're going to go in and you're going to go into your environment that you want to use, right? So it's drilled down to the specific environment that you want to do a forecasting on. And then from there, you can go into your cost analysis and see what type of views that you can do in here. So there's some custom views that can help you with that. So to help you, further drill in and analytics. So maybe you want to see, what are my subscriptions like? Let's drill into the cost analysis of my subscriptions. So I'm going to go, and then you can go through and walk through that one. And then the other one is budgeting, right? So with budgeting, this one's going to go in and it's going to show you how to build some of these budgets, right? So that way you can be really proactive and make sure that you're not spending over your budget. This is one that I even use. I use this one all the time on my subscription because I use a lot of demo subscriptions for my classes. So I have a budget that I implement to make sure that I'm not going over my spend. And I do it, as you can see in here, I do it based on the month. Right? So you can set your reset period. And so mine's down on a monthly budget. And so what that does is it really helps me go in and make sure that I'm not spending over my budget. Because sometimes we build things and we forget to delete them. Right? And that's what my case is. But you can see you can also do quarterly as well as annually. And then from there, specify the amount. And then what the other thing you do from that is you go in and then you set an alert, right? So once you've set the amount, then tell me when I actually hit that budget and the percentage of that budget, go in and warn me, go in and set, a receipt, or not a receipt, an alert. So you can see all in here, what are the options that you can do. The other exercise you can do is you're going to do rate optimization. So this one takes approximately 7 minutes. And so what this one does, it'll help you implement, it's going to go through and help you implement rate optimization. And so in here, you're going to work with your virtual machines as an example. You're going to create a new one, right? And then in here, let's go in, see if I can get this to, I'm just going to quickly click through this so I can get to the point. This is where you can see in here, let me kind of go back there a little bit. So when you're looking at building these virtual machines, as we heard, there's different types of virtual machines you can build. So, and when it comes to pricing, I mean, so what's the best, right? And this is where when you're building the VMs, you can go in and you can learn more about, essentially why would I use a hybrid benefit and read through that. Right. And then, if you've got hybrid and you've got existing server licenses, then you can do that. Right? And this is giving you that rate optimization and giving you the ability to really save that money. And then with the advisor is going to also recommend, why don't you resize your machine, or because it's underutilized, and this is a big one that, you'll see, I see a lot, especially in the industry, is that, we're so used to purchasing these virtual machines or these hardware on premises. You purchase hardware that's more than you need because you want to be able to scale easily, right? And it's not, and easily on premises is spending a lot of money up front. Whereas in the cloud, it's a different way of thinking. You don't need to spend that money, that big money up front. If anything, start small and scale as you need, because most of our services is very easy to scale, especially virtual machines. Right? If I need to switch it to a different SKU, and then I can easily do that with, shutting the machine down for 2 or 3 minutes, I can then save myself thousands of dollars potentially. So rate optimization is a great one to go through to really understand, how you can save money on your services, using cost analysis and the Azure Advisor. The other one is cloud sustainability. And so with this one, what you're going to do is you're going to be looking at how you can optimize your Microsoft Azure carbon emissions, right? So you're going to go in and you're going to track and analyze and mitigate emissions. You're going to look at optimizing resource utilization, and you're going to look at achieving environmental and financial goals. And this is what this one walks through. And now I think I saw it say it was 11 minutes to go through this one. So track, analyze, and mitigate your emissions that you're supporting through there. So in here, you're going to go through, follow the prompts. You're going to go into your subscription name, and you're going to specify your identity access. So this is your RBAC control, right? So setting your roles and setting the proper permissions. So there's one role, as you can see in here, which is called the carbon optimization reader. And so that's the specific role that you need for this the carbon environment. Right? So in here, you're going to select the members, who's going to give it the role to, and then you're going to walk through and set up your role. Next, now that you've set the permission, this is going to allow you to, they can view this data. So this whole point of this was so that I can go in and now I have the carbon optimization, and now I can filter and I can view this data. So it's interesting to see that not everybody has access to this data. You will need to set up that role access. So this exercise will really shows you how to do that. And then the rest of the exercise will walk you through it. Okay. So that's our FinOps on Azure and the 8 interactive guides. So try them out yourself, and I hope you enjoy them. Thank you.
In this demo coming up, I'll walk you through the FinOps review assessment. Hey everyone, so now let's go through a demo of a walkthrough of the FinOps review assessment. So to get into this review assessment, one of the best ways or the easiest ways to do this is to just essentially open up a browser. So I'm going to go into my Edge browser and I'm just going to do a search for Microsoft FinOps review assessment. And you can see I'm using Edge and using a Bing search. So in here, normally you would see it come up here. Always look for the links that have the learn.microsoft.com. I'm going to click on that. And here we go. Coming. There we go. So there's our FinOps review. And what this is this is a guidance. As you can see, I'll just essentially read this. It's a guidance to assess your organization's capability gaps, get recommendations for maximizing cloud business value using FinOps best practices. Now, before we start the assessment, you can see a little bit more information in here. So you can see in here, what is the length of the assessment? So average is about 40 minutes. It's going to be a multiple choice and multiple response questions. And then it's going to give you, and this is the essential piece here, the curated and personalized guidance. So allowing you to really see based on, these choices that you make, what is the results and what is the recommendations based on the FinOps. Now, when you run through these assessments, if you log in up here, so you can see currently that I'm logged in, then what happens is it will keep your sessions. So you can see I ran a few sessions in here, and you can always just delete them. So if you don't want them anymore, I can get rid of these assessments, or I can redo them. So these ones I didn't quite finish. This one I did complete. So it's really good. I highly recommend, as I was saying, I'm just going to clean this all up, that you log in to your learn.microsoft using, personal account, or you can use your work account. You can see in here, I'm using a work account. And then that way it tracks that. So let's go ahead and start an assessment. I'm not going to go through the whole assessment because that's, as we see, 40 minutes. So I'll go through a little bit so you can know what to expect. So I'm going to click on Start Assessment. And in here, you can give it a name. So, right, like I can go, I'll call this my FinOps assessment. Can't even spell it here, for my Fabricam production. Right. So think of and again, you can put a date, whatever you want in here, because maybe you're going to run different assessments based on different productions. So maybe you're doing one for your beta team, your test team, whichever. And the other thing too, this is a great one, is that you can actually link your Azure subscription to this. So what this does is it allows you to give recommendations based on what's currently you have in your subscription. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to show you kind of how to do this. When you go in on import, you're going to have multiple choices, based on the accounts. And if we quickly kind of remember that, I'm going to open up my whiteboard here, is that when we think about accounts, just give me a second here to get this working. Making sure my pen display is working. Okay, there we go. So when we go in here, there's my pen. Got to click on it. There we go. Is it always starts with, when you're setting up an Azure account. And an Azure account will a lot of time be associated with an email for your company. And then under an Azure account, you will have, and you can have, what we call multiple tenants, right? So I can have tenant A, tenant B. But this also means you can also have other Azure accounts, right? So it depends on, the rhythm of your business, right? So how your company is broken out into different infrastructures or different organizations. And then within the tenants is where you'll see your subscriptions. So the subscriptions will be associated to your tenants, and then your tenants are associated to your account. That's kind of like I like to call this the Azure hierarchy. So when we go back in here, what it's asking, and is what you can see, is I have multiple accounts that I actually am connected to. right? And so I'm going to select this one, which is the one that I always use for my demos, and I'll click on continue in here. Now, the other thing too is, remember back in my whiteboard, you can break it down by the subscription. So I select a single account. That account will be associated to one or more tenants. And then that tenant will have multiple subscriptions potentially associated with it. And then under, let me kind of scroll out here and move down a bit. A second. And then under your subscriptions is where you'll see your resource groups. Oops, actually, that's not quite right, because the subscriptions are tied to, the resource groups are tied to your subscription. So that's when we go back in here, you'll see there's my subscription. I only have one associated to this tenant. And then in here, there's all the different resource groups. So if you want to get a FinOps assessment to everything in your subscription, which is what I'm going to do in here, I'm going to actually say import and select that all of that. Right? Give it a second there so that it authenticates properly, and then I'll click on start. Now, when I click on start, like it said at the beginning there, it's all this is just multiple choice, right? Like not multiple choice, but questions, where are you in the cloud adoption journey? So I'm currently migrating, right? Click next. Next thing it's going to ask is, select the domains you would like to assess. Well, I'm looking at cloud rate optimization. Right. And I want to really understand cloud usage and costs. That's a big deal for me. And I'm also got many organizations that I want to align with. And then I click next. And then in here, and over here, you'll notice that as I'm clicking on things, it's going to start populating more questions that it's going to ask you later. In your organization, who encourages the adoption and implementation of FinOps best practice? I'm going to say my team managers or functional leaders. Click on next. And then section 2, FinOps policy in your organization is non-existent, exists but only covers the most significant risk, is part of the business, is a fundamental part of the business. So I'm going to say exists but only covers it's. So as you go through in here, and as you can see in here, I can add notes. Generally, people with your organization blank have FinOps, have no understanding, right? So this is where I can go through. And so as you go through each of these sections, it's going to go in and you can see these are the questions that you're filling out. So because based on the very beginning on what I was interested in, it gave me these sections. So section 1, you're probably like, well, where's 4 and 5? Well, on the original questionnaire, I was only interested in 3 sections. And so these are the questions it goes through. Right? So as you go through this and start completing it, then it's going to give you an assessment at the end of what is the results based on those questions. So yeah, give it a shot, give it a try. As when I go back in here, oops, went too far back. Let's go back in here and click on there. You'll be able to, now you can see it's gone through. I didn't quite complete it, so I'm not sure why it says that. But, it's essentially you can always go back, update it. You can create new ones as things evolve and as your organization change. You can go ahead and create new assessments and keep yourself apprised of what's going on and working with our best practices in FinOps. So that's your demo on walking through the FinOps review assessment.
Now that we just looked at those FinOps demos, let's get more into the pricing structure and what tools you can use to ensure that you're deploying your workloads efficiently and costly, saving that money. So the first thing we think about is, what are you going to use? What type of pricing works for you? And it can vary, right? You got options like, I run my workloads only a couple hours. Well, that could be pay as you go. I run my workloads all the time. That could be reservations, right? Or, I run my workloads and I need to meet all the time, but I had these peak performances. Well, that could still be reservations, but you're going to take advantage of things like, virtual machine scale sets. So it all depends on what does that workload do? And then when we look at that, we look at, the estimate project costs on Azure. So how to assess and plan for that? So when you do a lift and shift into Azure, so an Azure migration, one of the tools you can use, which I love, is the Azure Migrate tool. The Azure Migrate tool is great because it can tell you when the workstations that you have in your on-premises, how much they can cost when you migrate them over, which they give you recommendation and best practices. So you might think, okay, well, I've got a workstation running in my VMware and I want to migrate into Azure, but what SKU do I buy? Which one do I use? And this is where the Azure Migrate tool will be very useful for you. The other one is the provisioned throughput units. So that throughput units is how much you can put into it. So your PTU, it's a little bit hard to say fast, right? So your PTU and how much PTUs you can put into and want to pay for, right? So making that budget and making sure you meet that budget, right? And that could be these different ones. So you can see, I'm going to demo the pricing calculator later, and the pricing calculator is where you can see which of these is really going to benefit me. Maybe it's a combination of two, maybe it's just one. So using the pricing calculator can determine, does the using pay-as-you-go with Azure Hybrid benefit me, or does using, our savings plan, so the PTU and reservation with the hybrid benefit me? And can I use the hybrid? Right? So that's where you think about the deploying. And then finally, managing and optimizing. I like to call the Azure advisor your cloud consultant. I've always said that, right? It's kind of like your cloud consultant in the cloud, where it's just monitoring your systems at all times. You go in there, you got to meet your metrics. So, you could be sitting at like a 58%. And then based on that, it could be like, there's going to be things like, oh, I need to put security on that. I haven't been using MFA. I got a workload that I'm running that I only use 20%, but I'm paying too much for that. So this is kind of what your Azure advisor can use. And then obviously, or not obviously, but that big FinOps frameworks as well. So there's strategic pricing offers. So there's different savings plans that you can use. You can use the Azure reservation or our Azure savings plan for compute. Now, with the reservations, you can save up to 72% up to pay-as-you-go. However, and this is one of the things I always say, you think, okay, well, when would I ever use pay-as-you-go? That just seems silly to me if I can save 72%. It depends really on your workload. Right? Like for me, I'm an old, Windows Server administrator, and working with on-premises, I would never go into the data center or our server room and turn off a machine. You never do that on premises. But in the Azure cloud, you have the ability to shut these machines down and start them up automatically. So you can do it based on a schedule, and it can give you cost effective because you're billed by the minute when it comes to these workstations. So for example, if I'm only going to run a workstation, say on the weekends or 2 hours a day, does the Azure reservation really give me that much more costing as pay as you go? And if I'm going to run these workstations all the time, because it's an application that people need access all the time, then pay as you go probably is not going to save me money. Okay? And then when we think about the Azure Savings Compute Plan, you can save money by locking in. Right? If you commit to a 1 or 3 year plan, you can then reach lower prices. And then utilizing those dynamic workloads. So pricing, you've also got the Azure Hybrid benefit. So the Azure Hybrid benefit is when you have your own licenses that you've already purchased and you already have, a licensing purchasing plan that you're already using on premises. You can then use those licenses when you migrate your workstations into the clouds. Okay? So allowing customers to use Azure services and on-premises licensing at the same time, and then that allows you to give you that 36% saving that you can potentially get. So anybody wants to do this, you can go in, you can migrate from on-prem to Azure, and that could be Windows servers. You also see you can do SQL servers. And if you've got your own licenses, you can use those licenses. So the other pricing plan that we have is Azure Hybrid Benefit. And who can apply this benefit and why would you use this? So in the era of AI, migrating to Azure enables organizations to focus on innovation and business growth rather than infrastructure maintenance. Migrating to the cloud brings cost effectiveness and flexibility to build and maintain AI. Azure Hybrid Benefit is an Azure offer that helps accelerate cloud adoption and maximize your Azure savings. This Azure offer helps organizations reduce expenses during their migration to the cloud by providing discounts and on licenses and subscription. It allows organizations to allocate their savings towards modernizing their infrastructure and adopting a cloud-first strategy. This benefit not only makes the transition to the cloud more affordable, but it also acts as a catalyst for organizations to embrace migration at a faster pace. With Azure Hybrid Benefit, organizations can achieve greater flexibility and financial efficiency. This strategic pricing empowers businesses to innovate and stay competitive in the era of AI. So maximizing Azure savings is key to then allocating more budget towards innovation and competitive differentiation rather than infrastructure costs. So when we think about Windows Server customers, they can save on average of 36%, and SQL Server customer can save on average of 28% compared to the leading cloud provider. For Linux customers, you can save up to 76% when combined with reserved instances, which we talked about earlier. Migration and being cloud ready, Azure Hybrid Benefits grants 180 days of migration rights for Windows and SQL Server, allowing you to run your workloads on premises and in Azure at the same time. For Linux customers, it allows to switch your Linux VMs between pay-as-you-go and bring your own subscription billing models to get more flexibility and control over your costs. This Azure offers extensive coverage through different services and products. Through Windows Server with SA, different services in Azure like AKS, Kubernetes, run Azure dedicated hosts, Azure Stack HCI, and AKS and HCI can be run at no cost. Flexibility to commit on demand 1 or 3 years when used with other offers like reservations. So plan for that. When you think about your savings plan and reservations and Azure Hybrid Benefits, they can all work together. With just using pay-as-you-go, your total is 1.9 million. Now, when we look at with the savings option, you've now saved that much. So combining your optimizing compute costs and thinking about using Azure Hybrid Benefit, think about using reservations, any of our PTUs, those cost-saving plans, you can then transform your journey and really save. So now that we talked about a lot about the compute cost savings, when we think about AI, and I mentioned it before, we talk about provision throughput units, otherwise known as your PTUs. We can still do pay-as-you-go, right? That's an option, great for when you're testing things or developing things and you're not running these systems all the time. That's where pay-as-you-go comes in really handy. But when you're ready to deploy your AI models, then what you really want to look at is that provision throughput unit. And in our AI studio, we do have something called the capacity calculator, similar to like the Azure pricing calculator for other Azure services. So comparing those costs, you can really see how you can save when you're working with AI. In this demo, I'm going to walk you through the Azure pricing calculator using a scenario.
For this pricing demo, I'm going to walk you through the Azure pricing calculator. But before I actually demonstrate the pricing calculator, kind of want to give you an understanding of what I'm going to demo, and I'm going to whiteboard this. Let's get into my whiteboard. So first things first, with the pricing calculator, you can estimate costs on any of our Azure services, but I'm going to focus on virtual machines because I'm going to show you a real example of how, using and doing cost comparisons in Azure pricing calculator can really work for you. So I'm going to give you a scenario of a company that I worked with that had this virtual machine running, and they were paying more money than they should have to run this virtual machine. Now, with virtual machines, where there's different types of saving cost optimizations. So you can either do savings plans, right? You can do reservations. You can do Azure Hybrid, or you can do pay as you go. Now, the thing to be aware of with this is that the Azure Hybrid is our licensing optimization. And what that means is the customer can use their own licenses. Customer uses their own license. Right? So you might have bought a licensing package from Microsoft. So now you can go ahead and use that. Now, the savings plan, you can commit to for 1 or 3 year, right? And with this one, this can give you up to 65% of cost savings. Now, this one it commits to what we call a specific hourly expenditure. And you can do this on specific compute services. So it doesn't work for all of our compute services, but this one you can do, even though you commit to 1 or 3 years, you can do this, on an hourly expenditure, right? And giving you that 35%. So this one's really good for flexible, like if you have VMs that are very flexible across different compute resources and region. So they're great this is more for a dynamic environment. Where the reservations is also 1 or 3 years. Right? And then that 1 or 3 years, this one is going to give you up to 72% of savings. And this is really good too. You'll get paid. You can also pay this up front or monthly. And this is going to be to a specific VM and a specific region. Whereas the other one, it's more flexible between your VMs and regions. This one, you're going to, for a fact that you're going to have predictable workloads in a stable infrastructure. So let's say if you have an application that you're running ongoing for your company, so like a specific company application, and then that application, you're going to need it, right? So let's say your main web page or whatever, and that's going to be running ongoing. That's when I would recommend reservations, right? Or, so that way you can commit to that time, that 1 or 3 years, and get that cost savings. Now, the other thing to note is that, let me kind of scroll out here, is that with the pay-as-you-go is just an hourly rate. Sorry, I forgot to mention that. All right, so there's no cost savings with that one. It's just you're paying by the hour. Now, you can go in and you can use the Azure Hybrid with any of these types of deployments. So in my example, I had this company, they essentially had one workload, so just one VM, and that VM ran 24/7, and they used the reservation of a 3 year, because it was a machine that ran a batch job. And get this, they ran it weekly for 2 hours, right? So they were like, okay, well, I'm going to use the reservation because that's going to be the most cost effective. Well, I'm going to prove to you that this was wrong. And what I'm going to do is we're going to look at pay as you go. And we're going to look at running it. And I'm going to go 10 hours a month. Because if you do the math, right, weekly 2 hours, that equals like 8 hours a month. But I'm going to specify 10 hours because you want to turn the machine on, before the batch job runs and let it run, boots up and everything. And then you're going to shut the machine down after the batch job. So you want to give yourself a little bit of buffer at the front and at the beginning. So we're going to use the pricing calculator to see, the cost of this. So let me go into my browser. And so all you need to do is just do a search for Azure pricing calculator. Now, the pricing calculator is on our AzureMicrosoft.com URL, so look for that one. And as you can see in here, I can see all the different services that I can, do a pricing calculator comparison and so on. Now, any of the ones that you've already done, so if you've already gone into this and you did an estimate already, then you'll see it in here. And then you can always delete it. So I'm going to delete it. And right now I don't have any estimates. So now it's all blank. So now I'm going to go in and I'm going to add virtual machine, and you can see it adds that. And as I scroll down, there it is. So now region is also another one to consider for cost optimization, because some regions are more expensive than others, but also look at the fact that, okay, so now I know East US is the cheapest region, but I live in Japan. Well, that's not going to give you cost optimization because you're going to get that latency. So really, it's like if you take our Azure infrastructure AZ305 or AZ104 classes, they'll really teach you about that. I'm going to leave the default in here. And so I'm going to go in, and they didn't use the savings options. What they did was use the 3-year, and they also had the hybrid, right? So I'm going to go in and select the hybrid. Well, here, let me actually select none so you can kind of see. So you can see the original cost, and we'll write this all out here. So the original cost is $137.24, and that's just the pay as you go. Now, if I go in and I add hybrid and I add my 3-year reserved, I'm now down to $26.89. So with this one, the reservations, I got $26.89. Pretty good. Now let's look at it a different way. What if I leave it as pay as you go and I'm still doing the hybrid, but I'm only going to run that 10 hours, and that's because that equals a month, right? So I'm only going to run that 10 hours a month. Now look at the cost. Big difference, right? So now I'm looking at 96 cents. So when we look at these different costs, we originally started with this as the original, right? So this one was the original. Then we said, let's try reservation. Well, I got $26.89. Not bad. That's a good jump from here. But then now, look at that. Now I got 96 cents because I realized this workstation doesn't need to run all the time. So with the Azure pricing calculator, in that example there, you can really see how the pricing calculator can really give you an estimate based on how you're going to deploy that workstation. And sometimes we think about, maybe I'll deploy it and let you test how you're going to deploy it different ways to give you the best cost in there. And so that's a pricing demo for your Azure pricing calculator.
In this demo, there's an Azure hybrid benefit that is a lab exercise as well.
In this pricing demo, I'm going to walk you through the Azure hybrid benefit. This is a lab exercise, and it's one of our interactive guides. I won't go through all of it, but I'll let you show you what to expect. So let me bring it up here. So these interactive guides, you can see it's broken down by 3 types. You got the Windows Server, you got the Linux machines, and then you've got SQL. So whichever one that, or all 3, try them all 3. Or, whichever systems you are going to be working with, you can get a good idea of what to expect, how to deploy them, as well as what are some of the hybrid benefits that you're going to get. So let's go ahead and launch Windows Server. And so this goes in, and I'm just going to launch this, but I'm going to mute it. So that will walk you through. It is an interactive guide, and you can see over here, it will walk you through, and that's what you'll be hearing. So as you can see in here, and I'm just going to pause this right here, so you can see you can pause and jump ahead. This is going to deploy new VMs, and so you're going to get that hands-on. You're going to update existing VMs, and then you're going to reduce licensing costs. Right? So the real big reason why you want to do these is so that you can see how to really do that cost savings. So let's go ahead and start it back up. And I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. So in here, as you can see, you jump into the portal and you actually go through. And as I'm clicking on here, it gives you a really good idea of, kind of the hands-on, what to expect when building a virtual machine, setting up any of the settings in here. And always read over here, or you'll hear anyways if you've got the volume on. And then that will give you an idea of what you're doing and, why you're doing it, right? So why you're filling in this information, the password, and so on. And then I'm going to go back down in here, click the checkbox. So now this is, and I want to pause right here. So in here, let me pause this. Actually, I don't think I need to, but it doesn't matter. You'll see it starts talking about the Azure Hybrid Benefit. And the Azure Hybrid Benefit is that cost savings option where if you do have licenses that you currently have already purchased through Microsoft, you can go ahead and use these licenses in Azure. And so that's what this is doing, is saying, I want to do that. I'm going to add I do have the Azure Hybrid, and I'm going to confirm that. But for now, in this one, they're going to be using a pay-as-you-go. Then you just go review and create, and it just takes a second here. Think, oh yeah, it helps if I hit play again. All right, so review and create, and then click create. And so then that will go through and start deploying the workstation, and you can see that, and then click go to the resource, and then go into my expand settings, and then the operating system. And so now you can then see in here, so two ways you can do this, right? Use the Azure Hybrid. You can do it when you deploy the workstation, or let's say you do end up purchasing licensing later down the road, then you can actually go to your VM and add the licensing at any time, and then just confirm that and apply. And then that goes ahead and updates that, and it'll give you a different cost. So now when I go into my virtual machine, I can go in here, and I can also do this by doing this through a command line. So I'm not going to finish this off, but essentially you deploy the workstation in the Windows portal, and then you add the hybrid benefit, after you've deployed the workstation. And then this second part is going to have you do it using PowerShell. So I'm going to close that tab, and I'm going to go into the Linux one and open this one up. So the Linux one is if you're not working with Windows workstations, and let's say you're using Linux, what are the steps to do that one? So let's jump ahead here. And in here, as you can see, what you want to do is you need to enable the Red Hat cloud access for Azure. And in here, select your provider. And in here, you can see there it is that we want Microsoft Azure. So what this does is this will add your Azure subscription to the Red Hat provider, which is our Linux workstations, right? And then you put all the information in. So you can see it's a little bit different in this situation, because the Linux workstations, obviously they're Red Hat providers, whereas the Windows is, Microsoft providers. So you'll have to use a different portal to go in and enable that Azure Hybrid benefit. And then now I can go ahead and create my virtual machine once I've enabled the Red Hat information and subscription. So first thing to do, go to Red Hat, add all the information, and then you can start building your virtual machines using your Red Hat Linux workstations, right? And then in here, create your SSH key. And then in here is where you can select that. There you go. So yeah, so that's the difference between Windows and Linux, is that the Windows, you can do everything within one portal because it's Microsoft owned and operated. And then with the Linux, you'll need to enable the Red Hat Azure subscription in your Red Hat subscription. And then the last one in here is SQL. And as you can imagine, SQL is a Microsoft operated or Microsoft product. So everything, again, will allow you to do that within the SQL, or not SQL, but the Azure portal. So when I go in, I'm just going to jump ahead in here if it lets me. Yeah, so in here, what this do is enabling the SQL virtual machines, because you want to build a SQL VM, and your resource providers you might be required to enable that. So resource providers, if you take any of our AZ 104 or AZ 305 courses, you'll learn about what a resource provider is. It's essentially, I like to call it kind of schema of Azure. So in order for me to be able to use a service, I need to enable that, and that's enable that by using resource providers. Very handy, and that's kind of what that is. And so now allow you to register that SQL resource provider, which allows you to now create SQL VMs. And in here, in the shell button, this is where they're going to provision that using the Cloud Shell. Okay, I'm not going to go through all that as well, but so those are the three different types of hybrid benefits. So Windows, everything is managed in the portal because it's Microsoft owned and operated with the Windows Server. Linux, you'll need to go in and enable your Red Hat Azure subscription in Red Hat, and then you can build that. The VMs in Azure, and then SQL, you'll need to make sure that you've got your SQL resource provider enabled to create the SQL VMs, and then you'll be able to run the hybrid for your SQL licensing. So that's all about working with the Azure Hybrid Benefit, and I hope you enjoyed that.
In this demo, we're going to walk through an Azure OpenAI service provision reservation purchase process.
In this pricing demo, I'm going to walk through 4 different demos. Actually, I'm not going to say 4 different because I'll let you guys edit it all. Let's try again. 5, 4, 3. In this pricing demo, I'm going to walk through the Azure OpenAI service provision reservation purchase process. That's a mouthful. Essentially, what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through the AI Studio and how you can use the price throughput service and how to set that up. Okay, so let's take a look. So you'll see in here, this is your Azure OpenAI Studio. And in here, you first want to go into your Azure OpenAI provision and then into your capacity calculator. Here you can see the capacity calculator where for a particular select model and you can set workloads. And it also shows you how many PTUs you have. So for example, if you want to use a GP2.4, as you can see as a model, then you can go in and you can fill in the details, right? So, you know, how many calls you're going to do a minute, what is your peak calls per minute, and let's say you want to use 1,000 output tokens or 2,000 in this example, and then 1,000 tokens in model response. And the next step, you would be ensure what region you want to put that in. So to check that, we can close the capacity calculator, and on the quota page here, you can see the provision for the managed throughput units or PTUs. Right now I have 1,000 available, and this is going to be in Poland Central, which is the region where I plan to create my deployment. At this point, I have plenty of quota available for me to attempt to create my deployment. If for some reason I didn't have enough quota, I could quickly click to request quota and fill out a form to request more quota. Will be processed in about 2 business days. So the next step is I'm going to create the provision to deployment. To do that, what we're going to do is we're going to go to the deployments tab. And in here, we're going to click deploy base model. And then we're going to click on the example, which we're using was GPT-4. And then we'll confirm that. On the deployment dialog, you'll see that you've deployed the standard deployments for Azure. You might be familiar with this. The important difference is that you want to select for deployment type, which would be provision managed. And this is what tells us to create a provision deployment instead of a standard token-based deployment. Then I can set my deployment name, version, and most importantly, how many PTUs I want to use for this model. And then in here, I'll be able to case, so we're going to set to 50, and then I'm going to go ahead and confirm that pricing. Right, so in here, the dollar tells you how much you'll be charged. By default, you'll be charged by an hourly price, in this case, $100 per hour. And it tells you that you can purchase an Azure reservation to get a further discount. So I click confirm understanding of the rates, click deploy, and now I have my deployment creating. So now purchasing reservations follows this standard Azure model. To get to the reservations portal, you're going to click on the quota tab in the Azure OpenAI Studio, then click purchase a reservation. This will take you out of the Azure OpenAI Studio and into the actual Azure portal. Remember, reservations are standard Azure offerings and not Azure OpenAI specific. And so there's a specific place in the Azure portal in order to purchase them. Now, to purchase the reservations, there are 2 steps. You need to specify the type of reservation and then the number of PTUs you want to purchase. The type of reservation, right? So this is going to include your different types. And then in here, you want to leave the billing entire account, right? So an example here, I'm going to use, my shared, my management group, my single subscription. And then now I'll pick the term for my commitment. And the recommendations you can see under the 30-day usage. And now you notice you have some recommendations, right? That's because before I started this demo today, I had some deployments already running at the Australia East and Poland Central. And so that's where you'll get those recommendations. So let's go ahead and purchase a reservation for all of these deployments. So in Poland Central here, you can see there is a 1 month and a 1 year term for reservations. And for a 1 year term, you can either pay upfront as a 1 month or one monthly. Or you can pay or a monthly basis, that is. So let's pick 1 month, click add to cart, right? And then we'll select on view cart. And here we can see, we specify the auto renewal policy, the name of it. If I want to give it a name, I can remember that and the quantity. So 400 is what was recommended. And then we just added a 50 PTU deployment. So I'm going to change this to 450 to complete the purchase. I'll click review and buy. And here's some information about this purchase. And then I can click buy now and confirm that. And click yes. So note, this is once you create your reservation, you want to monitor its usage to maximize your cost savings, which you can do in Azure Monitor or in the Azure portal.
So now you can see in those demos how you can really implement those cost savings. So when we look at your cost savings and the best practices in using those FinOps practices, here are some links here that you can see where you can read up more on that. So working with the different Microsoft products, that's working with our solutions, the interactive guides, right, where you get to see that, and then reviewing those assessments, right, training. Going to Microsoft Learn, doing a training and going through this type of training that you're actually seeing right now. And then your Azure pricing, all the different types of pricing tools that you can use for your cost effectiveness, and then going into your pricing scaling. So those are some of the different guides, and we'll give links to those shortly. This concludes session 2, where we discussed understanding what FinOps is and why it is important. We also learned about pricing resources to optimize investments. And finally, we discovered Microsoft solutions and tools to maximize your cloud investment, including Microsoft Cost Management, Azure Advisor, Policy, and more. We'll now take a quick 10-minute break before starting with session 3, which is Establish Cloud Readiness and Set Your Foundation. Welcome back from break. Now let's begin with session 3 that discusses establishing cloud readiness and setting your foundation. All right, welcome back from your break. So now let's getting into establishing cloud readiness and setting your foundation. And then we'll do another break, and then we'll finally get into well-architected workloads. So when we talk about before the cloud, right? So working with IT management, they grew from a simple acquisition and function. An acquisition of technical equipment to support business processes required technical expertise and deep experience with a specific group of equipment vendors. IT management consolidated the selection, acquisition, and configuration of IT assets. Generally, these acquired assets included storage, computing, power, networking, and other similar assets that are required to power the desired business function. As the primary subject matter experts on the equipment, was also tasked with operating the equipment to ensure maximum performance and minimal business disruptions. Your server engineers, right? Your architecture engineers on premises. When the new business builds out technology solution, it has a clear need that can justify the significant expenses associated with acquiring assets or even building out full data centers. When it builds solutions, the businesses sees the acquisition cost as an investment in the future. After the business need is met, the perception of that same cost then finally shifts. Costs are then associated with existing solutions are seen as operational drag that's created by past needs. That perception is why many businesses view IT as a cost center. It's also why many IT organizations regularly cost control exercises or reduction in IT staff. So cloud management for cloud adoption efficiency. This is where we work with the Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework. Microsoft recommends different exercises to help organizations develop business and technical approaches for providing cloud management that powers ongoing operations. So to prepare you for this, there's 4 different stages you can go through. The first one, as we can see in here, is establishing a management baseline. So this one talks about, creating those classifications, working with those cloud management tools and processes to deliver those minimum commitments to operations management. The second one is we got defining your business commitments. So this is documenting your supported workloads to establish operational commitments with the business and agree on cloud management. So really working with your different teams. And then the other one is, or the next one I should say, is we have to expand the management baseline. Based on business commitments and operations decisions, make use of those best practices. Implement them with those tools that you can use to meet those best practices. And then finally, that advanced operation and design principles. This is working with our platforms or workloads that require a higher level of business commitment, might require a deeper architecture review to deliver on resiliency and reliability commitments. When we look at the methodology to enable cloud management, we can see that there's 4 steps to this. And this is all part of your cloud adoption framework. The Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework guides your customers in establishing tooling to enable cloud management across management baselines, business commitments, enhanced management baselines, and advanced operations. So as you can see in here, the first one is looking at that, establishing that management baseline, right? So looking at what do you have, what making that visible to the inventory, looking at your operational compliance, and protect and recover. Once you got that all set up, then you can move on to your business alignment. So what is the criticality, the impact, and that commitment? And then you get into your expanding that management. So once you've established it by working with all of these tools, then you can then look at expanding it. And when we look at that, that's where you can get into your enhanced baseline and then finally get into that advanced operations design principles. So this will all come out a little bit clearer as we go through the next preceding slides. So let's start with the first one, the management baseline. Why do you need this? Well, it's that well-guided management baseline that defines a set of cloud management tools and processes. When we think about management tools and processes, this is what's going to give you that guidance. So you're making sure that you're deploying your services and tools, but your services and your environment effectively. Right? What is the minimum commitment to the operations management? And what are your goals, right? Defining the basic tools, right? Focusing on the minimum options and process necessaries, and using that management baseline. So with the business alignments and commitments, why do you need this? This will help support business operations. IT management delivers processes designed to minimize disruptions to those assets. When an organization moves into the cloud, management and operations shift to create an opportunity to develop tighter business alignment. Business alignment with cloud management is required to rethink commitments to operational management in partnership with the business. As we can see on this slide, you've got your different goals, right? Document that criticality and relative business value for each workload. Establish clear performance expectations and work with your metrics. Document, track, and report on commitments to cost and performance. So as we look more into expanding that management baseline and advance operation and design principle, the first three cloud management disciplines describe a management baseline. The preceding articles in this guide outline a minimal viable product for cloud management services, which is referred to as a management baseline. The purpose of a management baseline is to create a consistent offering that provides a minimal level of business commitment for all supported workloads. With this baseline of common repeatable management offerings, the team can deliver highly optimized operational management with minimal deviation. However, you might need a greater commitment to the business beyond the standard offerings. When we look at workload operations, the largest per workload operations investment, highest degree of resiliency suggests for the approximately 20% of workloads that drive business value, typically reserved for high criticality or mission critical workloads. And then we look at platform operations. Operation investments is spread across many workloads. Resiliency improvements affect all workloads that use a defined platform, suggested for the approximately 20% of platforms that have highest criticality, typically reserved for medium to criticality to high criticality workloads. And then finally, we got the enhanced management baseline, lowest relative operations investment, slightly improved business commitments using additional cloud native operation tools and processes. Why do you need this? Well, you need to outline a minimal viable product. Right? For cloud management services, and it adds common improvements to the baseline that can further help organizations go beyond the management baseline, enhance businesses' commitments. Goals for management baselines, you want to reduce the number of workloads that require such investments. An enhanced management baseline could provide enough of an improvement to the business commitment. You want to improve the uptime and decrease recovery times with cloud-native tools and process to better achieve greater business commitments. Now, with the different tools that you can use, as you can see in this slide, we're looking at your different Azure. You've got things like your Azure Resource Graph, you've got your IT Service Managed Connector, Azure Automation, your hybrid runbook worker, your DSC, Microsoft Defender for Cloud. So these tools can help with enabling your advanced management operations and processes. Now, the advanced design principles, why do you need this? Aspects of your workload and platform operations might require changes to design and architecture principles. Management specialization is required to improve the designs of common platforms, or specific workloads to effectively minimize interruptions. So the goals for management baseline, improve that resiliency and design of workloads that can help in minimizing business interruptions. Detect trends and provide automated remediation, and then create repeatable solutions to minimize maintenance overhead by aligning the cloud platform team and cloud automation team. Use advanced monitoring tools to discover incremental improvements to address in the next pass of your system design, automation, and scale. So when we think about the workload specialization, these are the different tools that you can use. Azure Monitor Logs gives you great insights into what's going on those workloads. You got your application insights, just like the words say, that gives you insight into your application. Azure Automation, one of my favorites. I'm a server administrator, have been for a couple decades now. Whenever I say you want to make things easier, it's all about automation. Right? When you're working with hundreds, if not thousands of workloads, this is where you can save time and money. Think about the Azure well-architected framework, right? So the WAF, we talked about this earlier today. So with the WAF, this is where you can look at seeing what tool or what features or services will you'll benefit in that workload specialization. And then finally, there is so much documentation in the Azure Architecture Center that can answer any of those architecture needs for your workloads. So building a cloud environment is like constructing a building, house, stadium, or bridge. The structure you're going to build will determine your approach and architectural style. Depending on the structure, the foundations may vary. However, there will be common items across the various foundations. This is also true in the cloud. So when you're deploying, the cloud foundations may vary depending on your requirements or the scale you need for your environment. But just like construction foundations, it'll start with concrete and steel, and then cloud environments will also share starting elements, which is where a landing zone comes in. Let's look at what purpose they serve. So starting a landing zone is a tenant to help start an environment built from strong foundations, giving you those best practices, repeatable to ensure standardization. Consider technical skills of the team and their learning plans as part of the decisions you take in planning your landing zone. Let's look at the benefits landing zones can provide for your organization. So let's look at the two kind of design areas, as you can see, that make up your Azure landing zones. The first one is you have your environment, and then you have your compliance. Let me break this down a little bit. When we look at the environment, we start off is your tenant. I always say this is kind of like the very beginning, besides the Azure account. You're going to create your Azure account first, and then with that Azure account is where you're going to build that tenant. You can have many tenants to an Azure account, and that Azure tenant is also going to be associated with your Entra, so your identity service. Once you build that tenant and that identity service, then you look at your identity and access management. And that identity and access management is where you're going to start working with things like RBAC, PIM, right? All of those different types of Entra security models that you can use. Once you start implementing that, you sometimes will think about, well, I need to deploy many policies across multiple subscriptions. And when I think about that, I can do what we call resource organization and start building that out. And then finally, we get into our network topology and connectivity. And that's kind of, the different structures and the layout of you'll see. But with all of these design areas, you have to think about your compliance. So what is the security? And I mentioned that earlier is where you can start working with RBAC. But one of my favorite other ones that I love working with when it comes to security, especially when we're talking about Entra, is you're looking at PIM, right? You're looking at identity protection. Those are other services that you can use to support those types of security. And then when we look at governance, that's looking at policies. Looking at purview. And then we look at management. Management could be, using your management groups. All of that. And then finally, we get into the platform automation and DevOps. So all of these different design areas is where you can start working with your landing zones. And when you start building these different design areas and working with those landing zones, you're implementing your landing zone, that's where it's give you that automation, that repeatable capability. So when you set up the Azure environment, Azure landing zones focus on unifying technologies and technical guidance to help you build a successful cloud environment. In general, Azure landing zones offer what we call repeatable packaged environments. Think of it as, back in my day, we used to call that scripts, right? Deployment scripts. When I was a SharePoint administrator and I wanted to build different farms, and I was doing this as a consultant, I would have a SharePoint farm script. And then I could be able to go to different companies and deploy these farms for them using a repeatable script. Similar process, right? Or similar concept here is I'm using a repeatable package environment where I can deploy my different tenants and subscriptions, easily. Think about enable migration and net new apps. Also simplifying the process of starting a cloud environment to enable teams to focus on migration or innovation. Now let's look in detail at what we can consider to be the focus area for a landing zone. When we're thinking about our foundations in the cloud, we can look at it as workloads. If you're a software company and you build an application, you're probably going to have every environment purpose-built for that application. More commonly, a central IT team might look after the company's infrastructure, which runs a number of workloads, as well as some foundation tools and utilities in order to manage the environment and control access. In more complex enterprise scenarios, there may be a need to pull out the platform. If that environment, there may be a variety of different landing zones. Some stable, steady state applications may be operated by a central IT. Others with higher volumes of development with DevOps teams to need slightly different controls or processes to maintain their delivery pace. Now we look at the way it can go. It can go decentralized, central, enterprise, or distributed. So with decentralized operations, which is the first one, you're fully decentralized, no central IT team. The workload team makes up of the security governance and compliance decisions. You can focus on the WAF guidance for this one. In the central operation, so the second one up there, you're similar to central IT that you might have in a data center where you define all those rules yourself. You have to control what comes into that environment, a very common and control mindset. Focus on reducing risk, maybe at the cost of slowing down innovations. And then you've got your enterprise operations, so the third one. And for more complex requirements, this approach helps you federate access points and separate responsibilities. So the workload teams can make the decisions they need to, but still rely on centralized operations for centralized support. In this model, we're shifting away from a command and control mindset into a delegated responsibility model. This is where central IT or a cloud center of excellence supports these workload teams, providing guardrails in the form of a platform foundation. And then finally, we got our distributed operations. And some customers that we work with, especially global customers, have more distributed operations where different geopolitical boundaries may have different types of operations, or in different scenarios such as higher risk, high security, or sensitive data environments, you may have slightly different operations than the rest of your environment. Those are what we call complex operating models, or combination of operating models in your company. Environmental complexity grows as you go, setting up your Azure environment for scale, security, governance, networking, and identity, and the right operating model that scales as you build out. Finding the operating model that fits your requirements, well, it depends, right? So if your highest strategic priority is innovation, decentralized operations could be a good approach. If you're more concerned with control and reducing risk, then you want to look at central operations. If you're trying to find the balance and you want to democratize between central control and delegated responsibility, that's where you look at enterprise operations. And for these customers who are mostly focused on integrations, you want distributed operations. It's most likely where you need to land. Across these approaches, the scope changes a little bit on what central IT teams would focus on or who is accountable for decisions related to governance, security, and operations. What we see as a growing trend is customers that are finding the Cloud Center of Excellence model, CCOE, really fits their needs. And that requires them to have those enterprise-level operations and an enterprise-level landing zone. We'll talk more about this later on. Next, let's look at the concepts of landing zones, which is the natural progression in the conversation about thinking about operating models. So the Azure landing zone conceptual architecture, the destination or target end state of that journey, you've got scaled out controls and architecture to enable customers to grow and innovate safely. So depending on the cloud operating model chosen, you may arrive at this destination quickly or over time. And then you may go back and forth, and that can change. This may represent a subset of your estate if you scale into enterprise operations or distributed operations. We are learning from engagements with customers and partners, codifying best practices guidance for the cloud adoption journey. Let's dive into common starting points and the typical phase of a cloud journey. So you got your start, align, and enhance. Start is where you move towards the accelerated architecture with an accelerator. Align is where you review that design areas and assess what parts need to be improved. Enhance what other processes can be built on top of. No matter where you are in the journey, this is the best practice aligned architecture we want to improve. So the Azure Landing Zone Accelerators are a ready-made deployment experience for organizations where conceptual architecture fits with the operating model and resource structure you plan to use. The Azure portal-based deployment to provide a full implementation of the conceptual architecture, along with key governance elements such as management groups and policy. Let's then look in detail at how accelerators can speed up your deployment experience. So what if we could reach customer value at pace? This is where you have the implementation of cloud environments can last multiple months, requiring several technical resources to complete. What if there is a way to accelerate this process? But what we observe from a number of projects is the outcome is often relatively similar with common implementation patterns aligned to the guidance and conceptual architecture we include in the cloud adoption framework. Think about what you have done over the years. You might have been in IT for many years. Think of when you're deploying any application or server. It's a very common steps that you take with any software deployment, with any architecture deployment. So what we're trying to do here is we're trying to take those steps and make them easier for you by creating a landing zone that you can use to build this foundation. This foundation will include many automation for you to make your deployment that much easier. So when we think about and look at this, we reinforce the recommendation based on best practices that the customer should align to. So when we look at different tools, some of you might recognize these words in here, is that we look at the partner landing zone, so that's creation, right? The creation, your tool that you use, and then with that tool, you can leverage Bicep or Terraform. Bicep is a Microsoft product that's built on JSON to allow for that deployment, those types of automated processes. And then Terraform is from HashiCorp, right? So with HashiCorp, they have a solution that allows you to do automation. So with each one, this can give you that fastest path to the target architecture, giving you those environmental design best practices and compliance design practices, meeting those needs. So with the Azure landing zones, the cloud adoption framework approaches as a self-service activity. The objective is to empower each team that supports adoption through standard approaches. How we shouldn't assume that a self-service approach is the right fit for all scenarios. Successful cloud adoption programs often involve at least one level of third-party support. Many cloud adoption efforts require support from a systems integrator or consulting partner who provides services that accelerate cloud adoption management services providers. MSPs. They provide enduring value by supporting landing zones and cloud adoption, but they also provide post-adoption operations management support. Additionally, successful cloud adoption efforts tend to engage one or more independent software vendors who provide software-based services that accelerate cloud adoption. The rich partner ecosystems of SIs, ISVs, MSPs, and other forms of Microsoft partners have aligned their offerings to specific methodologies found in the Cloud Adoption Framework. When a partner is aligned to the ready methodology of this framework, they will likely offer their own Azure Landing Zone implementation option. Alongside the Azure Landing Zone Accelerator, Start Small and Enterprise approaches the solution available through partners are also fantastic options to help accelerate cloud adoption. These offers can help organizations progress on their implementation journey with an option of customized based on specific requirements. Terraform is increasingly common in cloud implementation, so it was important for us to be able to offer a Terraform-based solution for customers who have made investments in the technologies. These implementations deliver the same outcomes as we talked about throughout this presentation, helping organizations progress towards the conceptual architecture. This concludes session 3, where we discuss management baselines, business alignments and commitments, enhanced management baselines, advanced design principles, and finally deploying Azure landing zones. Let's take a quick 10-minute break before starting session 4, which discussed designing and governing the well-architected workloads. All right, welcome back from break. In this section, we're going to talk about designing and governing a well-architected workloads. So we're going to talk about the guidance that you can use, tools, and this is all using within your design, deploy, and govern stage of your Azure Essentials. So the 3 stages of adopting Azure at scale, we've already seen this slide a couple of times. Now we're into the design, deploy, and govern. And with this, we're going to talk about that governance. So what architectural guidance we can use for that. So why is governance important? Well, governance is important because it sets a balance between transformation and risk mitigation. Governance enables the creation of a balance between transforming, evolving your business with digital transformation and risk mitigation. And that's minimizing the risks to business outcomes and performance. So when we look at each one, who is responsible? Right? Let's get my pen working here. So when we look at that, who is responsible for monitoring support and operations? So finding those key teams and what services should be migrated, what roles and responsibilities that you need to define, and then which security measures should I consider? And with Azure, there's even not just with Azure alone, it's with the Microsoft Cloud, there is many different types of security measures depending on what you're deploying. What are the core processes that are needed for service management? How can I ensure a balance between innovation, cost, and agility? What organizational changes are needed? What key capabilities must I develop? And finally, what is the Azure governance building blocks? And so this is what the well-architected framework would be able to support you with. So with the cloud governance team, the comprehensive governance is a cross-team initiative involving cooperation and alignment across business outcomes, measurements, and strategy. The cloud governance team is responsible for evaluating and managing risk tolerance and creating policies for perceived business risks. Now, with the governance methodology, there's different governance models envisioning reaching a state that incrementally builds trust and confidence while achieving your business goals. Whether you start with an enterprise scale, which we'll give you a quick overview of later in the presentation, or with a start small and expanding landing zone, you should still follow these 5 disciplines of governance. We have your corporate governance, right? So the corporate policies, and they're formulated to detect potential problems. And then the 5 disciplines of governance are actionable and are rolled out in governance iterations. They help you organize, manage risk, and create guardrails for your cloud adoption effort. Using actionable, efficient, and comprehensive guidance, your organization can modernize while achieving your business outcomes. Let's look at how governance sets policies across the different pillars and learn more about the importance of a cloud governance team. So let's take a look at the first pillar in here. And this is the pillars of our well-architected framework. One of the first pillars you're going to see, and it kind of goes in order of the way you kind of deploy things or think about how you deploy things. And the first one you're going to look at is cost management. And this is based on, as you can see in this slide, this is based on our FinOps Foundation best practices. So when we think about cost management, there's different tools and services that you can utilize. And why do you want to use these tools and services? Well, think about a story that I can tell you that happened is there was a company that deployed these workstations, and they realized that first of all, they used these SKUs that were very, very costly. And they ran these machines, 24 hours, all the time. And so when they saw that they ran these machines and these SKUs that are quite costly, they would see their monthly bill and they were in the thousands. And it was for an application that wasn't utilized 100%. So what you can do is you can look at these policies that you can implement. First of all, limit what SKUs. Right? Don't allow those costly SKUs. The other thing that you can think about too, or apply for cost management, is using your metrics. Right? Using your Azure Advisor. Look at the Azure Advisor. The Azure Advisor would probably told this company, hey, you're using a machine that requires, or that is quite costly, but you're only using 20% of that machine. Right? And so these are the things that you can look at when it comes to cost management. And your FinOps Foundation can find that, or will let you know about these tools. Think about the security baseline, right? With security, a complete governance foundation, this is where you're going to want to continue your process of governance iterations by implementing a security best practice, right? Looking at your data and assets and network and making sure that you're, encrypting everything, right? You have the security baseline best policies. If you're using a hybrid environment, so you still have your on-premises data on-premise, and you might have the application in the cloud, how do you make that, cloud-based identity security infrastructure strong in a hybrid environment? And then what are the network requirements? This one's interesting because think about, does your application need to be available from people outside of your network and outside of your corporation? If not, then why are you opening it up? Right? So making sure you're not deploying these applications to all customers, right? Making sure that they can only connect to these applications using a VPN connection. These are things you want to think about when you're building that security baseline. And using any of these tools and services will support you in those decisions. The next pillar is identity baseline. Right? Looking and protecting your data in assets. So looking at the RBAC model, the role-based access control, that it's saying of, giving that only amount of access, granting the users only the amount of access that they need to perform their jobs. Or the other one that I love, what about just-in-time? Right? Just-in-time administration, right? Or the other one too is your PIM. So rather than giving the user the person, right? So let's say you are an IT administrator and you manage virtual machines all the time. However, you don't need to actually give them virtual machine contributor permission full time. They can go in using PIM and they can request that role, right? So that role whenever they need it. And then you can set it so I can request that role for 2 hours. Once that 2 hours is up, it removes that permission off of that user. Right? That's going to give you more protection at the role-based access level. You also, and that's, again, talking about PIM. There's also other tools like, using Entra. And Entra is where, you create your users in groups. You got directory federation, directory application, business to consumer, business to business. So what's the difference? Well, it depends on who's accessing your environment. If it's business to consumer, chances are you've got customers that are not part of your tenant that you want to give them access. Or let's say you're a company that's business to business and you've got multiple tenants that you're using, then you can create that business to business solution. Now, with resource consistency, this is one's a big key point for me, right? I always talk about, when I was a SharePoint administrator, always resource consistency, right? Using tagging, using name conventions. We actually, if you do a Bing search, we actually have a naming conventions framework, right? So you have the best practices on how to tag as well as how to name those, your resources, and keeping that consistent. You can apply a policy that ensures that they're tagging resources. If you're gonna create a virtual machine, you need to tag it, and you can enforce that. Right? So these are the things that you can think about or can implement to give you that resource consistency. Deployment acceleration. So again, another big administration tools or capabilities, when you want to automate and we need to deploy things over and over again, here are some of the tools we can use. We talked about Terraform before and Bicep and landing zones. So now let's say you're ready to start, deploying more workstations. You can use what we call infrastructure as code. You can do that CI/CD, continuous integration and continuous deployment. And there's many architectural best practices that you can leverage to support you, as I was just saying, the landing zone. So CLI is one type of scripting tool. You also have Azure PowerShell. And then the other one too that you can use to automate is you can use Bicep You can use Terraform. Right? These are all great tools for deployment acceleration. The other one, this one here, Azure Automation, I'm going to give you an example of this one. I don't know if you remember me talking about earlier how, one of the things we don't think about is we don't think about, on premises, do you go into the server room and shut a machine down? No, you don't usually do that on premises. So, but when we think about the cloud, in the cloud, yeah, you might want to shut a machine down because it might be more cost effective to use pay as you go. Because if only that machine's running, on the weekends or a couple hours a day, then maybe pay as you go, which normally would be a more cost effective solution. But you also want to make sure that that machine's on and turned off at the appropriate times. And this is where Azure Automation will work. This is allowing you to use PowerShell or Python workflows where you can go in and you can definitely go in and specify, oh, I'm going to say it's going to start 10 minutes before the due time, right? So let's say your machine needs to be running from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. So you can have it start and automate that at 5:50, and then shut off at say 8:10, right? So making sure you got a buffer before and after. So this is all tools that you can use to accelerate your deployment. So with the Azure patterns and practices, and that's working with our CAF, Cloud Adoption Framework, our WAF, right? The well-architected framework. With all of these tools that you can use, you can get some bigger context, right? So looking at that bigger picture and being able to see what you need to see in this journey. Right? And the change is more than adopting technology. It's adapting how you do business. One of the ways Microsoft helps you to do that is with best practices and frameworks, and where technical people can leverage the well-architected framework for workloads and the cloud adoption frameworks for organization. Remember, CAF is like peoples and processes, where the well-architected framework is more about your workloads and doing all of that. So we share best practices from our customer-facing teams, partners, and customers who have already undertaken the cloud journey. So this can happen at the organization level for all workloads or at a specific work level, but both need to be integrated for both at platform engineering teams and workloads teams to collaborate. So let's take a look at what is a workload. When we think of a workload in the well-architected framework, it can be all these different types of resources that you see on this screen. So when I think of a compute also can be not just a virtual machine. It can also be a container. Right? Anything that runs with a CPU, as you can see in here, anything that requires that. We also have it connected to a database. That is a workload. That's a type of resource that you need. And that resource is your data. And then you've got another compute. So essentially what it is that, the term workload in the context of an Azure well-architected framework refers to a collection of application, resources, data, and supporting infrastructure. So it's not just about the components, it's about everything that makes up that environment. So achieving a state of well-architected is what we look at is it's not a one and done activity. When we look at this, there's design leads to continuous improvement. Right? You want to look at opportunities to take that workload and always maintain that workload, review that workload. So it's an ongoing. So for example, we have companies that a lot of times they'll do that lift and shift. And I talked about that earlier. I said the Azure Migrate tool, it's great for getting your Linux or Windows, whether you're using VMware or Hyper-V workstations, into the cloud. And you do that lift and shift. And a lot of times that'll be the first step you do. And then once it's in there, and you're maintaining that, and you're monitoring that, you can look at the other services, right? Are modernizing that application, So continuously improving that application. So if I have, let's say 100 Windows VMs running a single application, and maybe they're just using .NET, Why can't I just put that into an Azure App Service and start looking at going from, what we call infrastructure as a service, right? So your IaaS, and start looking at platform as a service. Right? And that's giving you continuous improvement, modernizing those applications, and really using the cloud environment. So with the well-architected framework, we have what we call our 5 pillars. These 5 pillars, it's been in use for a few years now. Some of you might be saying, oh yeah, I recognize this, but yeah, it's the same one. So its guidance is given through published content, assessments, and the Azure Advisor. The Azure Advisor, as you remember what I called it, is your kind of like, I like to call it the cloud consultant. This is what it's based on, right? It's based on, your WAF. And so what it looks at in this WAF is it looks at these 5 pillars. So how reliable, when let's say you deploy an application, how reliable is it? How is it secure? What is the cost of optimization, operational excellence, and that performance efficiency? And then it takes all of that and it's going to give you an advisement on what you may need to change to get those best security or the best practices of that well-architected framework. So with these design principles, they help set that vision for the workload. The big considerations when starting to develop the architecture is they're the first step in the design thinking process. Those goal-oriented principles build a foundation for the workload. They're universally applicable concepts that are there to help all workload teams be successful. Each principle includes recommended approaches and the benefits of taking each one. So with that checklist, it helps the architects ensure they've covered all the important topics. So this checklist, there'll be a different one for each pillar. And the whole point of this is we want to make these deployments easier for you. Like I said, it can be very overwhelming deploying something into Azure. So with these frameworks and checklists, this can give you a guidance on, am I meeting those best practices based on these checklist recommendations? And they're very concise and descriptive. They'll tell you exactly, so maybe you'll look at, I'm going to look at this one, select the right infrastructure, resources, and SKUs. Right? I can then click on here in the code in the PO03, and I can see in more detail exactly what that means. So you know what that guidance is really trying to give you. The recommendation, so here's the detail. So once here, as I was saying before, I can go on P03, and I'll use this example, P04, and then in here, when I click on that, this is what I'm going to get. Right? So as you can see in here, it goes in depth. It gives you that expert guidance and that consistent structure. And you can really see the details of that recommendation. So now with the trade-offs, it's a big focus area. Right? We know that when working through the design or improvement of a workload, decisions need to be made to meet business requirements that will require finding a balance between those WAF pillars. And it's also vital to understand how achieving the goals of one pillar might make achieving the goals of another pillar more challenging. So this is where we want to make sure that we provided great guidance to help customers work through those trade-offs and reach the decisions that were right for their workload and their business requirements. Now, designing pattern connections into the Azure Architecture Center, they help customers progress from design to build and get the resources needed to succeed. The connection between WAF and Azure Architecture Center is a really important part of our narrative and the toolkit for customers to be successful in Azure. Help evaluate how a specific Azure service can be included in a composition of a workload architecture. Guidance grounded in the 5 pillars for consistency. Golden recommendations for design included in the guides, as well as connection into product documentation for deeper information about how product function or its features. Now, with the review, what this does is this is your assessment. So it remains an important tool tool to help customers work through specific scenarios and best next steps, connected to Advisor to cover the workload architecture and configuration, giving you that guidance and giving you those checklists. So let's take a look at a WAF demo so you can kind of see what to expect when you start working with this tool.
So let's take a look at the WAF. And the WAF, as we know, is the well-architected framework. So I'm going to open up the browser here. And what you could just do a search for is I just do a well-architected framework, but make sure you put in Microsoft because other providers have a WAF as well. And then in here, what we're looking for is the Azure well-architected framework. I'm going to click in here and kind of walk you through this this site or page. So first of all, yeah, you can go in here and learn about it. And this takes you to our Learn articles on what is a well-architected framework. Over on the right-hand side, so over here, you'll see where you can learn about training. And then over here is all of the information and the Learn articles for that well-architected framework. But let me go back here and kind of break down this main page. So the one thing you'll see is right in here is kind of, what kind of materials we have for this well-architected framework. Essentially what's new, what are all the pillars, the 5 pillars, workloads, the guides, the training, the assessment tool, which is really great to use once you really get a great grasp on the well-architected framework, and then our Azure Architecture Center. So all of this information in here, as you can see, I hover over each one, I can link and learn more about, each piece, and then go back here. Now I can get into the assessment tool and start my assessment. Go back in here. I can learn, about the Azure Architecture Center. This one I really love, and every time I teach any of my infrastructure courses, I always send my students to the Architecture Center, because if you're a visual learner like myself, this is where you're really going to enjoy our WAF architecture design. So when I click on here and I scroll down, you'll get a nice, visual representation of these architecture designs. Let me kind of go back in here. So the other thing is training as well. Training, you can do online training, as you can see in here. And this is walking you through our Learn modules. One of the things I always recommend is that whenever you start working in our Learn environment, so our Learn pages, always log in. You can see I'm logged in here with my account, whichever account you want to use. It could be a personal account or work account, whichever one you want to track things with. And then as you're going through it, so you can see I've completed this one already, and then I can click on custom optimization and I can go through some of these pieces. But here's what it's doing is it's tracking what I'm doing in these Learn modules, so that when I go back to, my training and go back in here, actually, I think I went too far back. I did. Let me go back and go back to the well-architected framework. And I'll do a refresh. It should have picked that up. No, it didn't quite. It might take a second, or maybe I might have not gone far enough for it to track it. But essentially what this does is, while you're going through the Learn modules, it will track that. It gives you a level, right? It's kind of a fun XP, so you know how much you've done, and it does everything, tracks everything in the Learn modules. So let's go back again to that main page. You also got your pillars, right? So working and understanding, and you can see over here, they've got them broken down. And so when you click on each one and I go into each one, it'll give me, as you can see in here, more information, right? So each pillar will have, quick links, design principles, checklist, trade-offs, and recommendation. Essentially what we've been talking about in the theory part of the course, right? So all of that you'll see in here. So giving you lots of information in the well-architected framework. Sorry, go back here. Oops. clicking on the wrong thing here. And then also, again, this kind of gives you the breakdown even further. Well, it's taking these pieces and it's breaking it out a little bit more information throughout the page. So that's the well-architected framework. It's something that I highly recommend that you go through the Learn modules. This training is giving you a lot of information, but also go through the Learn modules as well. And then, take the assessment tools, play around in there, and really get to understand our 5 pillars. Thank you.
This concludes session 4 and part 1. Let's recap all we learned in part 1. Session 1 was apply Azure Essentials to adopt the cloud scale. In session 2, we discussed the cloud financial success and learned about pricing resources like the price calculator and working with the FinOps framework, and finally landing zones. In session 3, it was all about baselines and manage them using best practices. Learn about your cloud operations, disciplines, and business alignment. And finally, session 4 is where we got into our well-architected framework, all the tools and best practices to making your deployments compliant and automated. Thank you for joining us so far. We look forward to seeing you in the next session of the Microsoft Azure Virtual Training Day, Mastering Reliability, Security, and Performance Azure event.